You shouldn't be consuming right-wing podcasters. You should be consuming me instead. But I genuinely do think at a certain point it is like bad for you, and not in like a mental health kind of not going down any pipelines kind of a way, in like a genuine bad for like your physical health kind of a way. Like I think it causes inflammation of the body. Now I don't watch Candace Owens because it's bad for my skin, so I'm not like incredibly well versed on all of her controversies, but recently I did come across a story about 10 people found guilty of cyberbullying the French president's wife in lieu of the Candace Owens lawsuit. And then I remembered, oh yeah, Candace Owens is being sued by the French president and his wife. Why is that happening? Because she is unrelenting in calling her a man. And then I remember hearing about this story like maybe over a year ago, I think prior to the lawsuit, and just being so wrapped in confusion. Will her life be made materially better by this information being known? Like, why is she so willing to put so much on the line to prove whether or not she's trans? Like what? And then I remembered that second detail, which is that not only is this a lawsuit, a defamation lawsuit, but the rumored amount of money is in the tens of millions of euros. And I just remember thinking like, what am I missing here? Like, I don't have a single belief system worth that much money. This is no like dega lawsuit. Like this could make or break her, I'd assume. It just kind of feels like a lot of money on the line for the cost of unlisting some YouTube videos. But I'm not here to pocket watch Candace Owens, all right? This isn't what this is about. I'm only concerned about myself, and my belief system is up for grabs. For $100, yeah, round earthers are the problem. For $150, did we do the moon landing? I'm up for sale in like the 2025 way, not the 1850s way, but a little bit in the 2008 way. Now, if you're anything like me, you've been hearing bits and pieces about this lawsuit, but you don't want to cook your own algorithm by actually looking into it. And you also don't want to cook your own brain cells by actually looking into it. And that's where I step in. Because I would describe us as just journalists trying to get in the know. You know? So I have done the research for you. I've looked into her series. I've looked into the lawsuit and what they're alleging. I've read all the articles. I've done what you honestly should never have to do because you do have me. So this video is about the timeline of the lawsuit, about how we even got here, about Candace's beliefs, about how we went from conspiracy theories online to real litigation, like a real, actual, tangible lawsuit, what's said in the lawsuit, and all the information that you might be curious about as to why is Candace Owens willing to bet tens of millions of dollars and her entire career on the belief for some reason that the French president's wife is a man. That's what I'm here to let you know. And like I said, I'm going to try to not have any bias in this. However, I will be allowing myself 3 biases. And I guess I'm going to count the entire intro as +1 bias. The first bias being that I am not a fan of Candace Owens, but I want to focus in more so on what she says and the crux of the lawsuit and less so my personal opinions about her, because I still do think this lawsuit by itself will be very interesting. The primary reason that I even want to cover this is because I think regardless of how you feel about Candace or any right-wing podcaster, I think the precedent that this lawsuit sets and will set moving forward is going to be very interesting, because I think it's going to ask a huge question of what's allowable online. You know, there's a lot of conspiracy type spaces on the internet, not just Candace Owens' channel. And it's like, how far will they be able to go? What will they be allowed to say and not say? Is it going to be protected under free speech? Like, what does this mean for what people say and do on the internet moving forward? I'm hooked on this story, and now so are you.
Hey, if you don't give me all your online data, I'm gonna steal your online data. You can't get me because I've got Aura on my side.
Thank you to Aura for sponsoring this video.
Let me tell you a little secret. Your girl, me, has been the victim of a data breach. One time while on vacation, I suddenly just couldn't sign in to my online banking and get any of my own money from my own bank account. I was on the beach chilling, just trying to purchase my 4th Shirley Temple of the day when boom, locked out of my account. And services like Aura work fantastically in situations like this, because not only do they scan the internet to find these bad actors that have your information, they also make sure to take your data off of these sites and keep them off of these sites. Have you considered that they're not even only after your data, they're also keeping tabs on your family, people you're not even that closely related to, your neighbors, your coworkers, so many people. They offer services that help you monitor your banking 24/7, password protection, VPN services, and they send you alerts when something is awry, which is such a helpful feature. So if you'd like to not only get on top of your data, but stay on top of your data and not end up Shirley Temple-less on a beach, then check the link in my description, aura.com/simi, for 14 days. That's right, 2 whole weeks of Aura for free. Once again, that's aura.com/simi, and take control and ownership of your online data again. Go get that data, girl.
I'll give you a little background on Candace Owens, who honestly really needs no introduction. She's a popular right-wing American podcaster, kind of known more broadly for questioning everything, like being unafraid of diving into lesser-known theories, things that would be more controversial or even conspiratorial. She's been known for working with Ben Shapiro at the Daily Wire, but she was eventually let go from that position over anti-Semitic remarks. She was then also working with Charlie Kirk at Turning Point USA. She did actually resign from that position herself. She wasn't fired over some controversy surrounding anti-Semitic remarks. And then she eventually just kind of did her own thing. One of the most popular things that I think she's known for is her investigation into the BLM organization for the possible, I think, misappropriation of funds. And most recently, I believe her investigation into Charlie Kirk's death. Now, I have not deeply dove into either of those two things, so I'm not going to try to give you a rundown of what she said or did, but I have only seen short snippets, specifically of the Charlie Kirk investigation, most recently of some text messages between the both of them, which she seems to be implying could be meaningful, which in my opinion just look like a man in yearning. The only conspiracy I'm curious about between them two is why they never got together. Love them or hate them, they seem insanely compatible. Now, this actual lawsuit is about like a year in the making, like I said, but it did have the most recent update kind of being about people in Paris who are literally getting charged
for cyberbullying the French president's wife.
The judge saying that they believe that a lot of these people were acting in malice with intent to harm or cause reputational damage, essentially. But the conspiracy, the large conspiracy that's been going around surrounding the French president is that she is in fact a man. And this has been something that Candace Owens has said herself that she's willing to stake her entire career on being true. Hey Candace, it's me from the future. They take you up on that shit, just so you know. So I'm going to tell you a brief rundown of what the lawsuit specifically alleges that she says, and then I'm going to get into her Becoming Brigitte series, which is something that she did on her channel, where she actually talks about all these belief systems in more detail and double, triple, quadruples down on everything that she's saying. So at a high level, what is a lawsuit? What is the backbone of it? It's a defamation lawsuit by the French president and his wife to Candace Owens for information that they allege to be false and easily disprovable information about the French president's wife.
I didn't give really an intro on who the French president and his wife is, so this is the French president Emmanuel Macron, and this is his wife Brigitte Macron.
The lawsuit includes that Candace has said some of the following: that Brigitte is a trans woman, that she stole another person's identity, that the Macrons are potentially blood related, so like incest potentially, that the French president was chosen to run France as part of a CIA-run experiment, think MK Ultra, that they've committed forgery and fraud in an attempt to hide Brigitte's past, and that her past was misinterpreted to hide her transness and the truth about her relationship with Emmanuel, and also ties to satanic and pedophilic groups, and that she's doing all of this with a reckless disregard for the truth. Also citing the fact that they've asked her to stop multiple times and she did not, and as a matter of fact even doubled down. So I'm gonna help you try keep up with all the characters in this story, because if you're not French, there's a lot of gens in this story. But just so we're clear, Brigitte Macron is the French president's wife, Emmanuel Macron is the French president. I don't know if maybe this is the first time that the French are dealing with an American, but one of the most ridiculous things you can try to do is tell an American to stop doing something they really want to do, or to stop saying something they really want to say. I don't know if maybe they just are not aware of how people move on this side of the planet, but telling an American to shut up, not a good idea. Definitely not a good idea if you don't want people to know something. Like if you have an American podcaster that is saying something and you would like them to stop, one of the last things I would ask them to do is stop. So where does this all even start? In March of 2024, Candace publishes the first episode of her podcast, actually while she's still at the Daily Wire, not on her own channel. She speaks about Brigitte Macron possibly having been born a man. Now, this episode has since been deleted. I couldn't find it. Admittedly, if I had dug a little deeper, maybe I could. But from what I read, the claims that she makes in this video are very similar to the stuff that she says on her own channel in her Becoming Brigitte series. So I think we'll get to it. I don't think anything that she said in that video is something that I won't be telling you about in her other videos. But that was kind of the beginning of her starting all this, or at least I think getting down the wormhole of Brigitte Macron conspiracy lore. Around this time is also when she made the tweet saying something to the effect of she'd bet her entire career on the fact that Brigitte is a man. Hey, me from the future again. And then shortly after this, she was fired from the Daily Wire. Again, from my research, from what I can see, she wasn't fired over the Brigitte Macron thing. She was fired over other things related to some anti-Semitic remarks. Specifically, it was like differences in opinions between the company and her own view on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And then throughout the rest of 2024, she doesn't really stop making the claim. She hasn't formalized a way that she's going to like tell people about this, but we know throughout 2024 that she's not backing down. You know, if someone brings this up, she's going to respond and say, no, I still think this and I believe this 10 toes down. But in December of 2024 is when she meets with a man named Xavier Poussard. Now, Xavier Poussard is like a pretty well-known, I believe, investigative French journalist, and he was one of the earlier whistleblowers, one of the first people to kind of start making a lot of these conspiracy theories that maybe were just known in smaller online spaces or spoken about around Paris, more worldwide, I think. From what I understand, at least for Candace, he was a big source of information for her and her series and her own research. He was also in Paris at the time, so he had like a bit more boots on the ground as it pertains to things that he was hearing and finding out. But there were other French journalists who were also looking into this that were, you know, working at the time as well, but I think he was one of the bigger ones. And in December of 2024, she records an interview with him. She meets with him, they sit down, they chit chat, he gives her the rundown on what he thinks, what he believes, essentially becomes a really big source of inspiration for Candace Owens moving into 2025. And then in January of 2025 and February of 2025, that's when Candace posts the series called Becoming Brigitte, which I do believe is also the name of Xavier Poussard's book. And if there's one thing Homegirl's always going to do, it's hook you with a series title. And here's where I'll give you the rundown of each episode so that you understand from what I mentioned before that is in the lawsuit what she's been saying. And the original series, I believe, is 9 episodes. There's the first chunk of videos that start with an introduction and then 6 episodes, the 6th episode being her interview with Xavier Poussard, and then like an epilogue after, like a final episode. However, after this initial chunk of videos between January and February of 2025, afterwards there are 3 more videos in this playlist, in the Becoming Brigitte playlist, that are also a part of the series, but not really. You could see them as a season 2, you can see them as kind of a follow-up, but the chunk of what this lawsuit is about comes from these chunk of the first like major 6 episodes. And this is where she also starts getting, well, I think as she calls them, just legal letters. I think formally they would be cease and desist, but this is where they also start telling her routinely and consistently to shut up. So what I'm going to be focusing on in terms of running down the episodes is what was said during the first chunk, the first 6 episodes, concluding with the episode of Xavier Poussard. And maybe while we're going through this, you can turn it into a little game. Take a shot every time you think her lawyer had a panic attack. January 2025, the introduction. She literally opens the introduction with a legal threat that she got from Élysée Palace. She doesn't really say what this is, but I'm under the assumption that this is where the French president lives. And she is not taking it super seriously. She's reading the whole thing. She seems a little lighthearted about it. And I don't think at this point that she cares too much. Hey, Candace, me from the future again. They were dead ass. They are dead ass. And basically her stance is she wants to introduce the Western world to all this information because she feels like a lot of this stuff is stuff that we wouldn't know about because firstly, this is not like our leaders. A lot of it is also in French. So if you don't speak French, then this information is like very inaccessible to you. So she kind of wants to be the English conduit of this story to bring it to the American audience. And essentially the information that she wants to introduce her to is the fact that the French president's wife is a man. Citing that essentially getting these legal threats in the first place is kind of what lit the fire under her ass to want to do this even more, because she felt like just by nature of them sending this to her, there must be some information that she's saying that might have some truth that they don't want to get out. She also believes that the letter focused in on smaller details of the things that she said rather than the big questions and the big accusations, which to her also seems to point to some kind of belief that there might be some truth to what she's saying. So then she does this thing where she's basically like, okay, like if you want me to stop or if you want the truth to get out, answer my questions. And these are my questions. And there is a long list of all the questions that she's asked, but the ones that stand out really are asking if Brigitte has ever gone by any other name than Brigitte. Are the photos that have been published of Brigitte in the past actually her, like her wedding pictures and pictures of her in childhood, her famous family photo? Did she physically give birth to her children? Asking at what age she met the president, her now husband, and when did their physical relationship begin? And some other questions, but these are, in my opinion, kind of the big five. She continues to speak about the rumor at the time that Trump had some information, like salacious information about the sex life of the French president and his wife, which, do we have real issues or what? Like, what are we talking about? What are presidents talking about in these meetings? And that this caused this transatlantic panic, which essentially to her signals the fact that maybe there's some truth to all the claims that are being made that are about them, because why would there be this panic if there's no truth? Which is an interesting viewpoint, because I think like someone reacting negatively to rumors about them, I wouldn't necessarily immediately assume that means that it's true, because I think I would react pretty negatively to personal information about me getting out, whether it was true or false. If personal information about me is known that I don't want to be known, even if it's made up, it would still bother me. I don't know. She also cites the summer of 2024 Olympic opening, saying that that was a satanic ritual because it was trans people or drag queens, I think she said, that performed the opening ceremony and essentially recreated a painting of the Last Supper. And because of her Christian beliefs, she believes in Satan and satanic cults. She believes that this was like a satanic performance.
And the involvement of Brigitte Macron is believed that she knew or was involved in the selection process of picking the person who put together the 2024 Olympic opening in Paris, Thomas Joly.
Beyond this, she does start getting into what initially drew her to the story, which is the fact that Brigitte met her now husband in '93 while she was one of his teachers. She was aged 39 and he was aged 15. This is information that is Googleable, the ages that they met. Now, it is stated that during this time, they only had an emotional relationship and not a physical one, and that his parents had moved him out of Paris to a school in a different city to kind of create some space between them, but they did eventually reconcile, getting married in '07 when the president, Emmanuel, would have been 29. So they do have roughly 24-25 year age gap. She speaks about the connections that they have through art, media, personal connections to people that have allegedly had pedophilic pasts, such as Oliver Duhamel, who again, that is something you can look into. However, they assert that their connection was more professional, political, rather than personal, with Oliver Duhamel,
who has actually admitted to the claims of having abused his stepson.
Candace touches on other journalists who've attempted to report on them in the past who have since passed away, specifically Isabella Ferreira, who was reported to have killed herself, but apparently a lot of her friends believe that she would not have done that. And thus Candace is simply saying that while she was reporting on the Macrons that this happened. This is also mentioned in the lawsuit because of they believe the implication that Candace is making that they are dangerous or harming journalists who speak bad about them. And then she kind of ends this jam-packed introduction with this, and I quote, "I really hope they file that lawsuit. I really hope that Brigitte Macron adorns himself so bold as to arrive into the great state of Tennessee with all of his perverted thoughts about little boys. I really hope so." I could honestly end the video here, because if that doesn't sum up what this is really about, the French are coming. The French are coming. Now, episode 1 starts off with, you guessed it, another legal letter. Let's go. She is 2 letters in, and we are literally pretty much 1.5 episodes in, and 1 deleted podcast from the Daily Wire. And she has like another legal letter from the Macrons. She calls them legal threats. So that's why I'm calling them legal threats. I don't know if these formally would be called cease and desist, but she is calling them legal threats either because they're not cease and desist or because she's just not taking it seriously enough to call them that. I don't know, but she's kind of referring to them as legal threats. And essentially, it's the same thing. They're asking her to shut up. So she starts off episode 1 reminding everybody about the ages that they met. Candace actually asserts that she believes he was 14 and not 15, and begins with one of the larger stories, I guess, surrounding Brigitte, which is essentially the part of the lawsuit that focuses in on the fact that she is lying about who she is to normalize some of the things that she has done. There's a lot of intersecting parts of this story to make the larger conspiracy theory, which boils down to the fact that Brigitte Macron is not who she says she is, and that she has been routinely hiding and masking parts of her past in order to hide her identity because of all the things that she's trying to do, So essentially one of the first major conspiracies is that she has been routinely editing and curating who she was as a child, especially who she was when she met Emmanuel. She believes that a lot of the media surrounding Brigitte was trying to paint her, which is also something Xavier Poussard talks about, as this hot pinup doll who was essentially trying to break free of her Catholic conservative upbringing and was just like hot to trot, and everybody wanted a piece of Brigitte. Like, they kind of tried to make her seem like a bombshell blonde kind of a person. Please remember that I'm telling you what Candace Owens is saying. If you are lawsuit happy, skip over me, all right? I have no money. I have nothing to give you. I have a thrifted Prada coat that I recently found out is not Prada and a Time Magazine SpongeBob edition. That's it. I own nothing. I have no money. Save yourself the lawyer's fees. Also, caveat, please remember that I am recapping Candace's episodes. I'm telling you what is said in the episodes. If you want to sue anybody, sue Candace again. She has the money. But essentially, this idea that they were trying to make her seem like this irresistible hot bombshell in a way to try and normalize the age that she met her husband, to try and make it seem like he was also this super mature, artistic, savant, like so much more advanced than his peers, and that's why they ended up together. You know, he was a young boy and was just couldn't get enough of Brigitte. He was so much more mature than others, and then she was just this irresistible hot blonde bombshell. Who would say no? Citing specifically one woman named Mimi Marchand, who was like a PR consultant, and she was responsible for a lot of the imaging and, you know, was very responsible for their media look
and this specific framing of Brigitte.
And the reason Mimi Marchand comes into this story is because while she was close to them and helping them with Brigitte's PR image, apparently due to some legal troubles and, you know, various things that were surrounding Mimi Marchand that the Macrons didn't want to be associated with, they started to create some distance between her. And the belief is that Mimi, in an attempt to kind of like get back at her, you know, the girls are fighting, leaked some information about a plastic surgeon allegedly that Brigitte had gone to, who is well known in France for having done facial feminization surgery. It is believed that this was Mimi kind of like hinting at the public without explicitly saying that the rumors of her transness are true, because she went to a plastic surgeon who is well known for doing FFS. So this ties in several things, as you can see. The belief that she's not who she says she is, the belief that her PR image has been specifically manipulated to make her seem different than people believe her to be, the fact that she may or may not have seen some plastic surgeon who does FFS surgery. And then she also brings up her connection to Nicolas Gousquier, who's the artistic director of Louis Vuitton, who has connections to the family, but is someone who is heavily responsible for her fashion and dressing her, and, you know, also helping put her together, who is someone, based on Candace's recollection, routinely platforming trans people and using trans models in like LV shows and stuff like that. And then, still in episode 1, this is a meaty episode, she then gets into reading the full legal letter that she says, which, just for the record, says, which I'm pretty sure said like this isn't for publication, but the subject of the letter is false and defamatory claims about President Emmanuel Macron and Brigitte Macron. The letter does say not for publication or attribution, and she literally publishes the whole letter. The letter essentially says, listen, we attempted to not do this publicly by asking her to stop, and she didn't stop. So in this letter, we're going to do something different by writing another letter asking you to stop. Surprise, surprise, that shit didn't work the second time either. They specifically do mention in this letter Candace discussing the journalist who passed away, Isabella, claiming that Candace implies that the Macrons were responsible in some way for her death. They also say that telling her audience that she upped her security since starting the series further implies that it's dangerous in one way or another to speak on the Macrons. They also mention in the letter the whole age thing of when they met, saying that Candace said that they admitted to statutory when it comes to the ages that the president and his wife met, and they obviously deny this. Candace said that they unknowingly admitted to this by just acknowledging, I guess, in their first letter, the fact that they met at those ages, saying that kind of by default. Also, the fact that she believes that they met at 14, you know, you're acknowledging the beginning of some kind of relationship between them two at that age, and that's what she's taking as an admittance of statutory rape. They also speak about the fact that she's accused them of the satanic cult thing as it pertains to the Olympic performance that mimics the Last Supper. And she stands 10 toes down on this because she's like, I'm a Christian. I believe in satanic cults. Therefore, my belief that you're in a satanic cult is protected speech because it's freedom of religion. They do address that in the letter, saying that she is mistaken by believing that she's protected by freedom of speech and religion. They're also saying that because of how many views she gets and how she asserts what she's saying to be fact, that these things are being widely believed. And that the reason why it's coming across as defamatory is because she's not saying that this is alleged or claims, but statements of fact. And that's causing the president's wife mental anguish. And she says she's not going to stop, obviously. She stands 5, 10, 15, 30 toes down, saying that she's all about radical transparency with her audience and protecting children, specifically saying because she thinks Brigitte is a predator. And then, believe it or not, folks, this is only episode 2. Duh. Now, she continues this episode going into more of the false identity claims, specifically focusing in on what she feels like, how little of Brigitte's past is unknown, and then she dives deeper into a lot of the conspiracy surrounding her past. The fact that she feels like it's very hidden, there's not much known about it, there's very few pictures of her as a young girl. And she does then start speaking about in her family, the family photo, this one, I'll throw it up here, and the lesser known brother, Jean-Michel Trogneau. That's this kid who has a son, Jean-Jacques, Brigitte's nephew. Take a shot every time we come across a Jean, which is getting into 2 other conspiracy theories, kind of. But basically, one, that Jean-Michel Trogneau, her brother, looks way more like her than the person in the photo who's supposed to be her, the little girl in the photo. Also, that his son, Jean-Jacques, looks mysteriously like Emmanuel Macron. But that one, it feels a little bit more up in the air. There's not much to say on why they look so much alike. But it does kind of start as well, the conspiracies getting into also the elusiveness of Emmanuel Macron's past. The belief that people don't know too much about him. They don't know too much about his parents. They believe that there's been false information spread about who his parents and grandparents are. And that this could be in some way tied to Jean-Jacques, the nephew, who people believe looks a lot like him. And this is when we start getting into Emmanuel's past, or I guess kind of the lack thereof a past. In some degree, the MK Ultra stuff and the idea that he has somehow been groomed by the CIA from a very young age to become this person and work for the interest of higher ups.
And this is information moving into episode 3.
Citing some things such as the fact that his mom was a pediatrician who worked like the social insurance or social security office in France and essentially would help trans people get their new paperwork for their new names and like the legal aspects of their identities. And the fact that his dad was a psychiatrist, but people believe he doesn't talk about them that much. When it comes to his family, he mostly talks about his grandmother, and the stories surrounding that seem to be that he wasn't actually that close to her, that, you know, a lot of the stories that he's saying are not specifically true. There's this story that people believe where he talked about how his grandma wanted nothing more than for him to learn French, and now here he is, the president of France, but that she spoke a different language that I didn't write down the name of, but a different language that was common in that area that people are saying never actually existed. So he's saying his grandma spoke this very hyper-specific dialect that isn't real.
Worth noting that the source of this story, of who Emmanuel told this story to, who then told this story to someone else, and how people found out about it, is a little shifty. It seems like it's just like some guy said something to some other guy. It's not easy to track where this story originated.
But essentially, she also believes that the grandma was part of this grooming of him to become this world leader and to normalize certain things, saying that one of the authors of the books that she used to read to him as a child had pedophilic themes in it, and that she was doing that intentionally to normalize things that are considered pedophilic, such as large age gap relationships, and also the fact that it's a coincidence about his mother having worked in the social insurance office or whatever, having helped trans people get their paperwork. You know, the tie-in there of that Brigitte was way older, and also she believes that Brigitte is trans. You see the conspiracy there. I don't think that episode 3 was her letting up on Brigitte. No, she was just diving into. So she also brought up this wedding photo, trying to ask, is this really Brigitte, or who it is rumored to be her cousin?
It is believed to be her cousin and his wife.
And not Brigitte and her first husband, because she was married before she got married to Emmanuel and also has 3 children. And then the mystery surrounding her first husband, this photo, is it really her? You know, we're still in the midst of their past and trying to figure out who they were. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Episode 4. This is when we start getting more into the Jean-Michel Trogneau of it all. So just so we're clear, in this family photo, this is meant to be Brigitte. This is meant to be Jean-Michel Trogneau. However, it is believed that this little girl, Brigitte, is unknown who that is, and actual Brigitte is Jean-Michel Trogneau, who was transitioned into a woman, who is Brigitte Macron. Are we understanding? That's the belief. But of course, that begs the question, what happened to the little girl in the photo? If it's not Brigitte, where is she? And this is where she further dives into if they are the same person and if they've been faking it. And then episode 5 is kind of back and forth between getting into the story of Jean-Michel Trogneau and then also getting into more of Emmanuel's past. So what she talks about when it comes to Emmanuel's past is how he moved up in the rankings of the Rothschild Bank, how it's believed that he didn't know much about finance, but somehow made it very high in that institution, how he was able to get into schools without having passed the entry exam into schools, and just seemingly what people believe having a really easy time getting into very high up, hard to get into organizations without feeling like he had the qualifications to do so. Also mixed in with the Benalla affair, which is actually something that was brought up in episode 4, but I know just let me throw it in. Which is essentially his security officer that was caught in 2018, I believe, impersonating a cop and like beating up protesters at a May Day demonstration, and then somehow being fired, but still having his diplomatic passport to travel to speak to other world leaders, who was also believed to have like some connections to the Russian mafia, but essentially putting it together. Like, does he know some very powerful people? Is he surrounded by people with connections to very powerful people? And were they in some way responsible for placing him in these organizations without him having the qualifications, I guess, to have gotten these jobs without that?
Pointing again to the conspiracy theory of the MK Ultra, the CIA having been intervened or responsible for getting him to the position that he's in right now, potentially with powerful people because they have some incentive to put him in this position, to use him essentially as a puppet for their own interests.
When it pertains to Jean-Michel Trogneau, this is also when we talk about a woman named Veronique. This is more from episode 4. But in episode 4, we talk about an interview that was done by a woman named Veronique, who was a trans woman whose identity was hidden on the show. However, people believe very strongly that this Veronique person on this show was Brigitte. People say they sound the same and they have similar turns of phrases, use similar words. They seem to talk very similarly. So people believe that Brigitte Macron is this Veronique character on this interview. They were disguised in like a dark shadow so you couldn't see them, and also using an alias name. Now, the connection there is that Jean-Michel Trogneau, if you believe he's a real person, was married to someone named Veronique. The Veronique in this interview claims that she lived with a woman. People are just putting that together, like, was the woman in question Jean-Michel Trogneau's wife named Veronique, since she took the name Veronique? That's the conspiracy there. Trogneau doesn't actually exist. She was the one living with Veronique. Also believe that Veronique herself in legal documents does not write about having had a first husband based on what these screenshots of her legal tax forms, which was just interesting to me because how easy is that information to get? That's such an interesting thing to find. Like, can you just find that about a person?
So just to insert maybe another 0.5 bias here, I do find it a little bit hard to wrap my head around the original source of these documents. I'm not sure that you can just go to the French tax document office and just ask for someone's tax documents and they'll just give it to you. Also, all the screenshots that exist of this tax document are very small slivers of the bottom of a tax document, or just one chunk of it, not the entire document. Also, it's never really explored why someone might just not list every single spouse they had. If there's any other logical explanation for when a person is filing tax documents, if they've been married multiple times in their lives, if they have to list every single spouse they've ever had every single time. That's not really addressed if there would be any other logical explanation as to why this could happen.
If you believe these screenshots are real, that's what people are saying. She doesn't ever write about having been with a Jean-Michel Trogneau. But episode 4 and 5 do kind of intertwine. So in episode 5, continuing off of the story of is Jean-Michel Trogneau Brigitte Macron and was Veronique just Brigitte Macron? Do I need to explain this? Okay, this is Jean-Michel Trogneau, Brigitte's older brother from the family photo. This is Brigitte. People believe that they are the same person. Jean-Michel Trogneau was married to Veronique. However, people are questioning if that ever happened because Veronique seems to not really talk too much about him. So people are thinking that Brigitte, the one in this interview, used Veronique's name because them two were actually just roommates or living together, whatever. Jean-Michel never married, whatever. But they do have a son, Jean-Jacques. And then the explanation for who Jean-Jacques is some connection to Emmanuel because people think they look alike. Are you caught up on this really simple story? And then in episode 5, they kind of get into the whole story of the belief. The real crux of the belief is this app called Face++, which is kind of this Chinese face recognition app that people seem to believe works really well. People seem to think really highly of it, and that when you scan Brigitte's current face against some of her childhood photos, it has a really low confidence that they are the same person. But when you scan Brigitte's face with Jean-Michel Trogneau's face, the app seems to say that it has a very high confidence that they are the same person. In the episode, she doesn't show the app working or scanning. We just have screenshots of the results that show that. And then getting into episode 6, where we essentially get the interview with Xavier Poussard, who I mentioned earlier is a really big source of inspo for Candace for all this information, and where she feels and who she credits as a huge inspiration for her having even started this series and also getting into this whole thing. I think kind of the person who seems to have fully convinced her that Brigitte was a man. And he says, he kind of just gives, I guess, not more, but I guess the same details that Candace gives, but I guess if you're inclined to believe in these theories, he might be a more credited source just because he lived in Paris. He has since moved to Italy. Essentially, though, he was physically there in France, Paris at the time, and was saying basically that he was getting a lot of information from people on the ground, that like people would look at pictures of Brigitte, and prior to all this going on would just say that that's a man. Like they just knew, and that he then researched and looked into it, and that's why he's landed at the conclusions that he has. He's an important voice in this space because of his physical presence in the space at the time. Then we get into July of 2025. And this is when the lawsuit is formally filed. Brigitte and Emmanuel Macron filed a 22-count defamation and false light lawsuit in Delaware Superior Court. Candace has expressed confusion as for why it was filed in Delaware and not Tennessee.
So some of the reasons why include that Delaware gives the court jurisdiction over Candace Owens' companies as well, because they are incorporated in Delaware. They also have a longer statute of limitations for defamation claims, which is 2 years. So that lets the Macrons include a broader range of false statements and not just like the most recent ones that they said. Corporate plaintiffs very often do go to Delaware because of its more business friendly laws.
Again, no dollar amount has been set for this, but it is just rumored and believed to be in the tens of millions of euros. If they were to, or when they eventually add a dollar amount to this, I would imagine this dollar amount would be a really large dollar amount, because it has to be a dollar amount that's large enough to incentivize Candace Owens to stop. You know what I mean? And she's pretty successful and wealthy, so like $100,000 was never gonna cut it, you know? And then in August of 2025, so shortly after, this is when she does her sit-down interview with Tucker Carlson to discuss the lawsuit, which she's made abundantly clear that she does intend to fight, and that she believes that they're just trying to silence her and quiet her down and impoverish her because she's saying something worth saying. Also discloses in this interview that in February of 2025, so what I assume to be fresh off the heels of finishing Becoming Brigitte, she got a call from the White House, from someone very high up in the White House, and also Trump himself, asking her to stop speaking on the Macrons, on the request of the Macrons, either while they were in the US or on their way here. However, the topic of the actual conversation that they were meant to be having with Trump was about peace efforts in the Ukraine war. The fact that two major world leaders who are supposed to be having discussions about war are talking about Candace Owens should stress all of us out. That is astounding, to say the least. Honestly, it kind of makes me start having some conspiracies about Candace. Candace said that the person who she initially spoke to prior to Trump framed it as a condition. A condition of what? Peace? What is going on? Does the fate of the Ukraine-Russia war lie in the hands of Candace Owens? Girl, unlist the videos. People are dying. Like, it's funny, but is it? You want to laugh, but should you? I'm going to hope and pray that that was an inference, or that was something said in jest that maybe, was misinterpreted. I want to stake my whole career on the hope that Candace Owens is not responsible for ending the Ukraine-Russia war. And then she does say that she did speak to Trump and that he seemed confused by the whole thing. And he said that, as she said, he'd seen her up close and then Candace said that he said that he'd seen her up close and she looked like a woman to him. So case closed. Do also want to make it clear that, remember, this is Candace's recounting of the event. From what I can see, I don't see the White House having confirmed this or Trump himself. I don't have further confirmation that this happened. This is Candace's retelling of this thing that happened on the Tucker Carlson podcast. Candace maintains that this is about her freedom of speech and that this is powerful leaders of a foreign country attempting to silence her. And she believes that this is about foreign intervention on America's freedom of speech. Now, there are some notes on this in terms of where Candace legally stands. In terms of foreign intervention, the French president and his wife are acting as private plaintiffs, not as the president and first lady of France. So this isn't too much to do with the French government. They kind of are acting on their own here. And also to remember that freedom of speech is not absolute. It's not like totally unfettered, obviously, because if it was, then defamation lawsuits couldn't even really exist, right? But what makes it defamatory is, did she act with actual malice, knowing falsity or reckless disregard to intentionally defame these people? And her defense is she's attempted to get the truth several times, but they didn't answer her question. I would assume their defense to that would be, well, you didn't need us to tell you that the stuff that you've been peddling was true for you to believe it. So all of a sudden, just because we didn't tell you it's not true, you know what I'm saying? Like, by that logic, then there's no reason for her to believe that what she believes is true. They never confirm that. So like, to say that, well, I can't confirm the opposite is true because you didn't confirm it, then what's your basis for believing the things you believe to be true? They never confirm that either, you know? Also, respectfully, I think we've seen enough of Candace Owens' behavior to know that even if they did outright say yes, no on that list of questions, she is not the type to take these things at face value. So I don't know if them just saying yes, she's a woman would have been enough for her. I highly doubt it, actually. So publicly, she's kind of framing this as a free speech issue, but it's much more narrower than that in court. You know, it comes down to specific statements of fact and whether they were false and whether she's been pushing them as fact despite them being just claims. Were they defamatory? Did she continue to maliciously act after receiving these warnings? Because that's kind of what's at the heart of what is defamatory and what is a defamation lawsuit. As of January of 2026, as I've mentioned, we have seen, as I mentioned, 10 people found guilty of cyberbullying as it pertains to Brigitte. This did happen in Paris, but they do also have freedom of speech laws over there. So I think it is very interesting to see that there are people who are getting like in real legal trouble. There are people though whose case were dismissed, I think, citing that there's nothing inherently dishonorable about calling someone a man or calling someone trans. But it's just to point out the fact that there are other legal actions that are happening surrounding Brigitte Macron, surrounding these statements of conspiracy and stuff like that. And there are people who are getting in real trouble for some of the things that they're saying. So in conclusion, first of all, I want you to thank me and clap for me for the fact that I watched the whole series for you and read all the articles I read and actually had to sit through at least some chunk of a Tucker Carlson podcast. Do you understand how inflamed my gut is? Also, I learned throughout all this that right-wing podcasters have the most random sponsors. As for the claims that Candace specifically makes, I think how much weight you put in them have less to do with the claims itself and more to do with how much you believe in Candace Owens. Like, how much do you trust Candace? If you are inclined to trust her and trust her judgment and trust her inferences, then I think you're inclined to believe everything she says.
It's my opinion that a lot of the claims that she makes is really easy to poke holes in, but I think you're never even gonna get there unless you have some inherent skepticism towards Candace Owens. If a person is inclined to believe her, I don't think they're going to be able to see through the easily pokeable holes.
No, it didn't. My drive to follow this lawsuit is less so about Candace specifically. Like, I think it could have been anybody going through this lawsuit and I would have been in like 1,000%, because at the end of the day, what I think is interesting and meaningful is how this is going to set a precedent, in my opinion. I think regardless of how this plays out, this is going to be meaningful because I would place Candace in the realm of conspiratorial type content. And at the end of the day, that's something that exists on the internet, you know, love it or hate it. That chunk of the internet where people are hypothesizing and coming up with different things and all these things and like thinking about what could be true, what couldn't be true, and like is not like a Candace Owens specific things. Maybe she's one of the more popular people, of course, to do it, but it's not her specific. And it does beg the question, who has more rights in this situation? The people discussing certain subject matter or the main characters in the subject matter itself? I think that this will be precedent setting and such an interesting lawsuit, because if Candace Owens loses, I am so interested to see the fallout of that, because what will that look like? I'm curious to see, how does this impact the conspiracy centric chunks of the internet, where that is what people consume, that is where those communities are from and where they live. Like, where are the lines? I'm curious and I'm excited. That's why I can't lie, I'm hooked on this lawsuit and I'm excited to see how it turns out. So what is the point of this video and what is the wrap up? After all the research that I've done and everything that I've looked into, what I've come out of this thinking is, Candace Owens actually the powerful world leader that we need to be fearing? And that, my friends, is the end of the video. I am so exhausted. I cannot even get into how long this has taken me to film. The main reason being that I've filmed this once before, the audio was fucked up and I had to do a bunch of refilming, but I am very curious to hear about your feelings on it, what you know about this lawsuit, if you are grateful and happy that now you do not have to look into it because I've told you everything there is to know so far. And also, if you like, what you think the precedent this lawsuit might set will be. Do you think nothing? Do you think it's not news? Do you think it is? I'm curious about your feelings on it. I am starving. I'm going to go get a baguette and some French fries. But as usual, if you've made it all the way to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.